Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Weaving Possibilities. I'm here with Savanna Harvey today, who is an interdisciplinary creator, facilitator, and independent artist. They are a host, a producer, and overall creative. Today they're going to be talking quite a bit about hosting in online spaces. The word that we've all been using this past couple of years is pivot, and talking about how they've created a community online. So this conversation is so timely for myself and for CDLI, and we also touch on climate change. So kick back and relax and watch the show. Hi, Savanna. I'm really excited for us to have this conversation about what's possible. But for those who maybe haven't met you before, and those who are really keen and interested to learn a little bit more about who you are, can you feel free to share a little bit about who you are and what it means for you to be kind of connected in community?
Yeah. Well, hello, my name is Savanna. My pronouns are she, her, and I am always reinventing how I describe myself. I think that's kind of the nature of being human, but currently some of the titles that I'm going with are things like artist and a host or a facilitator type human, as well as a event space and arts producer. And
Awesome.
I work out of Treaty 6 and 7 territories.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Yeah, I mean, and if anyone wants to get connected with you, there's all of those really great opportunities, including TikTok, which I have yet to be able to see, so I will definitely look into that. I guess, so the main question I start asking folks really is like, where do you know from? So whatever that might mean for you, whatever resonates, but the idea of like, where do you know from, Savanna?
Yeah, so I would say that I know from a few different places. And so I have perspectives through those particular lenses, and then also perspectives that are the combination of all of those layers of lenses as well. So the first one is probably the arts lens. So I'm an artist working in the community, creating a spectrum of performance, theater, performing arts kind of events. So those are opportunities to gather, basically. So there's that perspective. And then I was also quite fortunate in the journey of my career to have come into contact with some really just fabulous individuals who were working at the intersection of social justice work and arts as well. And what is our responsibility as artists working in the community and gathering people together. So I also have this lens of social justice and anti-oppression practices in leadership, which is one of the ways I connected with CDLI. And then probably the final lens that I look through is a climate action lens, and then more specifically my area of speciality, art as climate action.
Right. Interesting. The lens around, how have those lenses maybe shifted a little bit over this last year? Like you mentioned, the idea of like, every time I introduce myself is a little bit different because there's a lot of, everyone's sort of in flux and changing. So I'm curious, what has that meant for you the last maybe couple of years? Like how has that sense of that lens shifted for you?
So this lovely production value that I'm able to put together here is probably the biggest indicator. So as an artist working in events and gathering and space and place, the pandemic obviously threw a huge wrench into that. So I was one of the individuals who was able to make that pivot, as we so often refer to it, online. But it was really not so much a pivot and a lot more of a desperate leap into the void for a lot of artists, a lot of arts organizations, a lot of arts-based communities, including audiences as well. And what emerged was a really stark illustration of the digital literacy gap that we have in society. So there are folks like me who are very comfy in digital space and with technology who really thrived and found even more community, even more opportunities for expression. even more place together. And then there's this other group of folks who don't have that level of digital literacy, who became even further isolated and further disconnected and further disenfranchised.
Do you think part of that, like that sense of online, I'm curious, how has it been for you with your connections? Like, do you feel like you mentioned there's been some new people that you've been able to now connect and build more community with, and what has sort of surprised you about this, about like going into this sort of into the void and becoming a bit more, flexing those like digital skills? What surprised you?
I think as someone who is very comfy in digital space and whose interest in digital communities preceded the pandemic, I worked in the public library system for several years, and that was a huge awakening to how I was really taking my digital literacy skills for granted. Like the level of digital literacy that I have, I didn't realize how good it was because it was just my baseline, right?
Right.
So working in the public library system kind of got me on to realizing that I was an exception, not the rule. And then from there, one of the things that I've taken into being an artist who's gone to doing a lot of interactive media, particularly digital and mixed or augmented reality kind of gathering, is being keenly aware that there is this gap and that we do face this sort of interesting space of accessibility that we're not used to navigating. In the arts community, it's in the past few years, we're just starting to really think intentionally and program for accessibility and start thinking about how do we offer options to audiences and the communities that we bring in order for them to access and feel comfortable and thrive in the space. And so once we go digital, it's been interesting to see how going digital has removed barriers for some folks, especially people who have caregiving responsibilities in the home, whether that's small children or elderly parents or other dependents, and it's very difficult for them to get out of the house. These online gathering spaces have been an opportunity for them to still access community without having to figure out the logistics of care. People with chronic illness as well have found that the barrier is lowered when they don't have to leave the home to access programming. But then, of course, then we can return to that digital literacy gap again, where are you providing subtitles or automatic closed captioning or ASL interpretation, or again, thinking about even just baseline digital literacy. We've gotten to the point where a lot of folks are very comfortable on Zoom, but there's limitations with the Zoom interface, particularly when you're trying to make art. So if you're going to ask audiences to access a new software, are you teaching them how to use it? Do they have the technology at home that is going to allow them to even use and access the software? Do they have enough broadband connectivity? So yeah, it's been an ongoing journey around programming and trying to make that programming accessible and facing just new challenges in that space.
Has there been sort of a particular situation or circumstance where you wanted to share, share your work online with us last year that has maybe like a success or a learning specifically from a certain situation that you want to kind of speak to?
Sure. One of the things I can talk to is maybe two of the online programs that I'm currently running right now. And some of the things that I've learned, particularly throughout the pandemic as a digital producer, and then just the difference in between doing some of those like larger scale sort of product events versus this new kind of programming that I'm exploring, which are more process events. And that's something that I think is a really interesting shift once you get into online space. So the thing I'm referring to is I run two programs. One of them is called, are you ready for this? Production value. One of them is
Oh, all
called
right.
the write-in.
Cool. Ah, all right. Love it. Love it.
And
Writing.
this is a gathering space for writers. And so basically what we do is we gather online, the writing community does, and we do some writing sprints. So we put a timer up, folks work on their own projects and write. And then during the breaks, we gather and we talk about writing, and we talk about maybe like indie publishing or digital strategy for artists, or ways to potentially monetize your art to help combat some of that precarious work that we're so often faced with as artists, and low wage work as well, to try and make things more financially stable for artists. So what's interesting about running this program, which is a weekly program, as opposed to what the majority of my work is, which is like online events, is that in this space, because it's a weekly space, we've got folks coming in and out. They're able to attend as they are able. And because of the longevity of that programming, we're able to actually build relationships with people because we're seeing them on a regular basis over time, in a way that one-off big flashy events are not really ideal for building relationships and getting to know people, right? So that's something that I found really interesting. And then one of the sort of accessibility things about this program streams on Twitch is that the audience interacts in a text chat, which is quite accessible for folks, in a sense that you don't need to mess around with the microphone. You don't need to figure out your camera. You don't have to have a fancy computer with a graphics card that's current from the last 5 years. So being able to interact in a text chat has a fairly low technological barrier. And again, not everybody has the energy to be on camera during a programming. Like, people talk so much about Zoom fatigue as well. So being able to participate and having options for participation is something that I've been thinking a lot about with programming. The other show program, stream, I kind of use all these words interchangeably now, but the other one is called The Workshop, and it's the same sort of thing. It's a weekly gathering space where we bring projects and we can work on our own stuff, or we could work together on a project. And there's the ability to connect live in the text chat, but then we also have a Discord, which allows folks to access community and networks that share their interests, share their values, but they can do that in a way that's convenient and manageable to them. Like, you can pop into a text forum, leave a message, and then go off into your life and then pop back in. And the time commitment that takes is lowered. So yeah, I've been thinking about how maybe both for the communities that artists tend to foster, because a lot of the time we are in some sense community leaders. I've been thinking a lot about shifting programming towards things that are more long-term, as opposed to really intense bursts of programming, and slower paced as well, just spending time with one another. So the opportunity to just write and hang out, or build something, as is in the case of the workshop, and just hang out and just leave this sort of unstructured conversational time to really connect with one another, is something that I find really interesting. And then shifting this focus away from product and refocusing on process, and again, just being with each other and spending time with each other. And those are some things that I think a lot of folks don't necessarily associate with digital communities, but which actually they're quite adept at doing.
Like, has that? Yeah, thank you for sharing both of your projects, or streams, I guess, of how you are engaging people. But with the write-in, I'm curious a little bit about where what has been sort of the impact for people who maybe haven't had that community before. So, we're talking about, like, they've been, there are definitely different writing groups within sort of like the city where people are convening together, and maybe not to have that, and I'll be able to do online in a format that's also a little bit different, right? So it's like, it's not, I can imagine, where you're just sharing a story here, sharing there, and that those moments, those beats where you have to kind of wait for the response or wait for the feedback or send an email here, or that it's a little bit different versus this is live and happening. I'm curious, like, what has been the impact on some people who, like, how it's been resonating and landing for some of the people you've been in community with and facilitating these sort of write-ins? Is it what has been really helpful for them?
I think it's the combination of being cognizant and respectful of people's time while trying to balance that with the need to connect. So one of the things that's nice about the write-in is you work on your own stuff.
Right.
So you get the benefit of being in community and getting breaks where we do chat amongst one another, but it doesn't eat into your already precious and limited time in the current society in which we live, when we're always short of time. So it still honors a creative practice. And that's something that I think is important for everyone to have, not just artists. I think, creativity and creating art is something that just enriches your soul. And most people enjoy engaging in some form of creativity. So having the opportunity to carve out that time. And I feel particularly with writing, it can be really hard to protect that time, that personal creativity time, because that is something that is so easy to keep deprioritizing, booking over, canceling this week because something came up. So when you have a sort of scheduled community space where everybody's going to get together and honor and spend time on a creative practice, it really helps reserve what is kind of essentially enrichment and self-care time in community.
Yeah, I think to your point, it keeps that sacredness around the practice, but also it's like, oh yeah, there's a community here. Like, there's people that I'm kind of responsible to in some ways, or accountable to like show up, to, like, I don't know, having never attended necessarily the write-in, but like being able to, like, oh, I worked on this past week, and having people sort of care and feel invested in that, and to your point, like the process, versus necessarily I'm kind of here, and that, curious about, like, that sense of responsibility though, like that you maybe feel like you have towards putting these, like how has that what has that been like? It's just like to oh yeah, no, I need to show up at these times. I mean, and I'm sure, like, in previous elements in your life and in career, showing up and putting and hosting, convening people as part of, like, the lens that you look through. But I'm curious, has that, like, sense of responsibility changed a little bit because you're online, or shifted in any way?
I think the sense of responsibility when we are hosts, that stays the same. But the tools that we use to accomplish it are different, because we're no longer in physical space, we're in digital space. There's a lot of stuff that transfers from sort of previous best hosting practices. So, for example, something that we were doing in physical gathering spaces was room agreements. So when we get together and we talk, what are the rules of engagement in order to help everyone feel comfortable expressing themselves and having a real conversation in this space where people feel safe, but also we can be honest with one another as well in these conversations. And so we have some of those equivalents that can just transfer right over, like these room agreement things. So the way that manifests online is with these streams being on Twitch. One of the things is that you can set up rules so that if somebody wants to pop into your chat and start engaging with the community, there's a little section that pops up, which are the rules, and they have to agree to them when they join the chat. And there isn't a lot of room in the Twitch platform. You have to keep it kind of short and sweet. But for example, over in the Discord, I have a Google Doc in order to circumvent, again, the character limits, because these things just need to be longer. And we put together community guidelines for ourselves as a way to help nurture the sort of supportive community that we wanted in that space. And then taking advantage of the tools that are available to us already against some of the really common things that we've seen that are not so great about digital space. For example, you can ban people. And like, if people are misbehaving and being disrespectful and just generally or genuinely trying to cause trouble in the community, you could just ban them. Like, take advantage of that.
Right. Interesting. I think the idea of even as someone who facilitates often and brings people together. Similarly, I've really I think online spaces I've noticed it's those guidelines or boundaries or however you want to frame it are even sometimes more important in my experience, because people are maybe used to a certain way of navigating the discourse between people online, even in Zoom, that sometimes that it's harder to sometimes maybe pick up some of those sort of things. And I think it's just for me, it's really resonated as a really important piece for people to like, how will we treat each other? Who are we responsible to? Who are we in relation, whether it's a bunch of strangers meeting or people who are even like family members, right? What does it look like to sort of show up in this space? And also I think being okay with, to your point, that accessibility piece where, there's so many, I think, competing distractions as well. And, we're the Zoom fatigue, but also the sense of like, thank you for coming and feel free to engage in the best way that is possible for you. Is there oh, go ahead.
Oh, there's this really great culture on Twitch that I think, Twitch is not a perfect platform. There are no perfect platforms. It's not a perfect culture. But the one thing that Twitch is good at is live, because it was a live first platform, and it's developed a really rich culture around that understands that different people engage in different ways. So, one of the great examples of that is lurking. It's a well-established way of engagement, which is passive engagement, and it views passive engagement as also a valid way to connect. So lurkers are people who are in the chat, they're watching the stream, but they don't have the energy or the capacity to contribute to the conversation, but they are present and they're listening and they're engaged. And that's recognized and respected as a valid form of participation in the community. So, thinking about how when we're designing interactions, different people have different comfort levels and different needs. And when we look at, like you said, how do we connect in digital space and how do we treat each other well, and what are the rules of engagement socially in this space? One of the interesting conversations we're having right now in the Discord around these streams and these arts and creative communities that I'm hosting is we're looking at maybe doing like quarterly artist meetups that are video chats. And a lot of these folks are like internet people. Like, I don't know them in real life and they're not from my local region. But one of the reasons we thought that having video chats together could be beneficial is it's a more immediate sort of way to connect with someone. You get to see their face and make eye contact, you get the benefit of body language, and that sort of nuance is so often lost in an online forum.
Right.
But also, and respecting people's boundaries and privacy on the internet, definitely. But when we start to strip away the anonymity of digital space, when we actually start to get to know one another and have conversations with each other, that thing that happens in digital communities where sometimes we treat people in a way that we would never treat them if we were in a room with them and actually knew them. When we chip away at some of that anonymity, we do start to create community accountability and connection. And again, I think that goes towards fostering the sorts of digital spaces that that serve us, basically, because they are what we make them a lot of the time.
What are you looking forward to in maybe this upcoming year around the opportunities that might be arising for you as it relates to being more online? And I know you mentioned a little bit about those videos, but anything else that you are really kind of getting excited for, or where this momentum of the last year for yourself has sort of built towards? We're oh, now something I didn't see at the very beginning of all this, now I feel like it can be a bit more bit more realized because I've sort of been here cultivating away. What has sort of come up for you that you're getting excited about?
I think the opportunity of digital space as another way of gathering has really captured my imagination with the possibilities that are available through that avenue, and particularly because of that digital literacy gap. There aren't too many folks who are nurturing intentional community spaces online. That sort of work is something, that community development work is something that is far more common in physical gathering and local context-based community work. And I'm excited about the possibilities of bringing those practices online and seeing where that takes us and what that connection and creative space can grow.
Yeah, I mean, you've already even in our short conversation yesterday and today, you've already kind of inspired me a little bit as well as like what's possible for even myself, but also for others. I'm curious, has there been someone else that you've been role model, like that has been a role model to you, or even if it's just been you lurking around in their spaces about what they're doing or how they're cultivating that sense of community?
Yeah, I think there's one creator in particular whose work I find really interesting and informative, and they're on TikTok. Love TikTok. So Professor Casey is an ethics professor who specializes in digital space and technology. And Professor Casey's content is fantastic. And these conversations around how do we be ethical in digital space, both in our own conduct, but looking also at the ecosystem that we are interacting with. And things come up such as copyright and ownership, and of course, surveillance capitalism and rights to privacy. And, it's this huge spectrum of ethics in technology and the internet. But I think that those conversations are really important ones to be having folks who are qualified to help lead those discussions and provide solid information, such as someone who literally specializes in that area of expertise, I think is something that's very valuable. And then disseminating that information, decentralizing it out of the institution and into general practice, I think is also something that's really important and an exciting opportunity for digital creators, the science communicators, and the professors who are doing public communication and public work of their research, I think are really interesting, valuable folks.
That's so, I think that's one of the ways in which I think that sense of I think just generally culturally, I think we will be more, if not already, having to really kind of confront some of these sort of bigger pieces around how we navigate with each other online, in maybe even from the different ways in which we think about just sort of being more passive, like Facebook or whatever it's called now. And then it's but what does it mean to be sort of, online, or things are being recorded, or there's so much more information that I think has to be, that we're maybe a bit more responsible for. I wanted to ask a question a little bit around, the lens that you look through around climate, and how have you sort of been feeling or managing maybe some of what I see anyway, some of the shifts for people around that. So, I mean, it's always a conversation, and I feel like prior to the pandemic, it was, Fridays for Future. There was a lot of interesting momentum, I think, that was happening. You had Greta, you had the conversations, and then it was the pandemic, which I think people could argue that I also think we need to even more important to maybe look at climate. But I'm just curious, just a couple of thoughts that you have around that shift, maybe the last couple of years, and where people might be landing as we're on the end of the meetings in Glasgow and all those sort of things. But just curious, any insights or thoughts you have about how that maybe has changed your lens too?
Yeah, particularly coming off of the ending here of COP26. The pandemic's been an interesting one from a climate lens. I'm not sure who originated this observation. It's probably several people, but seeing governments jump to action and take radical action to support folks throughout the pandemic showed that this sort of emergency protocol is possible, and it's just not being done for the climate. The political will is lacking. We absolutely had the ability to leverage every resource at our disposal if it was important enough. So it was this strange situation of simultaneously having hope because we could see rapid, effective mobilization taking place. But then it was also really demoralizing to know that that was possible and it was not being done.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think like a lot of the dialogue coming out of like the post COP26 is that yet again, what has been crafted as sort of official cross-governmental policy and cooperation is just, again, completely insufficient. So this notion of, well, I guess we are going to have to do it ourselves. And we are going to have to do work in community and take care of each other and find collective action that we can take in order to either at a municipal level move our governments forward. Calgary has just voted towards declaring a climate emergency. So these are the first steps, right? And in my experience, I feel like affecting change at a municipal level feels so much more tangible. So finding community, taking collective action, and exponentially growing our impact from just individual action towards collective action, I think that there is a lot of potential and hope in that. And I'm kind of very much feeling that that's sort of the way forward, because without that pressure from collective action groups, we're just not going to get the sort of action at a government and policy and regulation and the sort of transformational changes that need to happen in this sort of like a complex systemic problem such as climate change.
Something you said that was really interesting is how we can, you mentioned the word taking care, and I'm curious, like what does it mean for the other intersection of our lens you look at with your art that can help provide that sense of taking care of each other in that collective action? Any kind of thoughts about what that might look like, or what you want to do, or what's possible? Yeah,
it's a tricky one for sure. So something that, and I'm always learning. I'm always a baby in everything that I do. But something that I've felt like I've got a little bit of a better handle on over the past couple of years is art as climate action, and thinking about what I have to offer the environmental and climate communities as an artist and as a creative. So some of the things that have come out of that have been things like Creativity for the Climate, which was a workbook that we put together when I was the artist in residence at Youth Climate Lab. So that's a free community resource. You can find it on their website at the Youth Climate Lab website. And we were thinking about the intersection of creativity and climate action because, like I said earlier, creativity is soul renewing. And particularly when we're thinking about climate action, a lot of the time it can feel very hopeless. It can feel like we're just constantly trudging uphill, and we're being constantly confronted with things that are going to trigger our ego grief and trigger our sense of despair. So the way to combat that, I think, is accessing regenerative creativity in order to continue to renew our energy and spiritual and emotional reserves so that we can keep going, because it's not going to be a sprint. And I think that we have a better chance of staying in these sorts of hard movements and hard efforts if we're thinking long term. And part of that is taking care of ourselves, and part of that is taking care of one another. So I've been thinking a lot about how creativity is regenerative and how that is something that is absolutely needed in the climate movement. People burn out like it's so quickly. And one of the things I've really loved seeing as I've joined climate action communities is that we're seeing more and more discussion around regeneration and not burning out, and giving ourselves permission to walk away and giving ourselves permission to come around right back in when we're ready again. And I think that that's really hopeful. And then the other thing I've been thinking about, particularly on a more perhaps specifically art focused perspective, besides doing kind of like general creativity programming, is also the art itself and how the art is or can be climate action. So one of the big projects I've been working on for a couple of years is called Wastelands. And it's a immersive and interactive show about the climate apocalypse, basically, and the plastic waste crisis. So in addition to doing sort of like community creativity regenerative programming, I've also been looking at how we can leverage these skills and tools that we have as performing artists, which is to gather people, which is to connect with emotion, to create experience, to generate conversation and introduce new ideas. Those are all really valuable tools in activism, and particularly the kinds of tools that we need for climate action. So when I think about putting that show together, which will be like, you know, all of the wood knocking in the world with the pandemic and stuff going up in the spring, I think about like, how do we take this piece of art? And it's great that we're having conversations about climate, but how do we actually do something with it, you know? So this is a picture that I've got of a concept sketch that Lindsay Zest, my collaborator, put together. So this is the sketch that we have for the Wastelands design concept. And in addition to using the tools of performance and experience design to help communicate the intangibility that we're up against when it comes to climate crisis and the waste crisis as well, we're also building connections with local organizations, such as Plastic Free YYC in Calgary, Zero Waste Edmonton as one of our Edmonton partners, and connecting audiences with either community grassroots organizations or nonprofits, so that now that they are impassioned and informed about what we're facing through the art, and they have found community and they've had these conversations, it's like now they're ready for action. And I think one of the big gaps that we face is we are able to connect with community, we're able to communicate the problem, but then we're so often left with now what, right? So I think these partnerships with either grassroots organizations, local activists, formal nonprofits, charities, who are then doing advocacy work or policy work or, you know, more tangible action, if we connect these audiences with those sort of more action-based individuals or organizations, I'm quite keen to see what those collaborations can look like. So one of the things I experimented with in the last YouTube video that I made was I talked about basically I just filmed me like reorganizing my artist studio, but I used it as an opportunity to talk about the plastic waste crisis through the lens of how affordable storage is usually like really cheap plastic bins, and how that we need to be finding new ways of building materials that are affordable and light that are not plastic. So it was an opportunity to talk about the plastic waste crisis. And then at the end of that video, I shared some information, whether it was topics to research or like actual tangible action that people could take. Because I think a lot of the time that's the missing piece in a lot of art pieces that, you know, cross over in that like social justice space, is we're missing the now what that happens at the end of the show or the end of the experience. So I've been thinking about like, how do we address that gap? How do we direct people to the organizations that they can volunteer for, that they can donate to? How do we help people learn about how to engage in these complex governmental political systems? How do you find your representative? How do you contact your representative to let them know that your vote is attached to them taking action on the things that you care about? So
Right.
Connecting those pieces.
Yeah, thank you so much for providing like opportunities and ways to think about what's possible, but and also like what is like looking forward mean? Because I think both of those are two sides of the same coin, where it's like that one side of like you need to have that regeneration piece, like that sense of being able to not feel like to burn out, to then be able then to do some of these more concrete actionable steps, whether it's building on those connections and that working sort of in a circular nature, I think are super important, and you need both, to your point. And but I also think what you're doing is also creating to your the digital space also to have other people be a part of that, because your point of it being something that's a bit more accessible, being a more digitally will be really helpful to kind of build that community, and both of those things working in tandem. I want to thank you so much for having this conversation with me, and I'm really looking forward to not only following you on the various streams and opportunities you have, all of it, and I think and thank you so much for like providing some really interesting insights as well. Is there any other last sort of comments you wanted to make before we called it a day?
I think that's good. I would say, I think my only kind of ending note would also be that if digital space and digital community is not for you, that is also totally okay. There's a sort of strange discourse that emerged in the pandemic of like people seeming to think that digital experience and digital community was going to replace in-person community and in-person gathering. And it's not that. They're two different things and they can coexist. So I also want to say that as fun and exciting and flashy as digital stuff is, gathering in person and particularly local context community is still really important.
Thanks so much, Savanna. And that's a great way to end our conversation. So thank you.
Great.